One humid, ominous evening, the desperate crowd packed the opulent hall of the Altar of Wonders. Whispers rippled through the rows as thousands craned their necks to see Prophetess Juliet, the 40-year-old woman of grace who many believed could look into the very fabric of a soul. To the crowd, she was a saint in white lace, but today, an unnatural, churning dark cloud hung over the pulpit. Suddenly, the sharp cry pierced the air. An aide rushed forward, shouting that a man's failing life battery had been miraculously renewed by Juliet's touch. The congregation erupted in a frenzy of praise, but Caleb, a young man sitting in the back row, felt a chill of recognition rather than joy. He didn't see a miracle, he saw the same man who had performed this exact healing in a local slum just days prior. Doubt burned in Caleb's heart, fueled by the memory of his sister, who had died in poverty after sowing her last savings into Juliet's miracle machine. He knew Juliet was powerful and untouchable, guarded by armed prayer guards and a legion of devoted followers who would turn on anyone who dared question her. Beneath her regal white gown, Caleb thought he saw the shimmer of strange, dark scales peeking from her sleeves, a sight the blinded crowd ignored in their search for blessings. Years ago, Juliet had been a humble prayer warrior and a simple Sunday school teacher, raised to walk in the light. Everyone adored her, yet she struggled to build her ministry until she attended a conference where she met Pastor Benji. He pulled her aside with a chilling ultimatum: she would never have a true impact until she was willing to sacrifice. Driven by a desperate hunger for influence, Juliet agreed to a dark ritual, trading her chance at a family and her very womb for supernatural authority. That night, a dark, muscular energy, a serpent spirit, settled around her like a cloak, invisible to the world but tethered to her soul forever. After the ritual, Juliet's fortune shifted overnight, and fame followed her wealth. However, unknown to her followers, the woman they worshipped as a prophetess was now a hybrid of human ambition and serpentine malice. Every midnight, she would leave her gold-plated mansion to head for the riverbank. There, she would shed her human skin to commune with the marine kingdom, joining other occultic leaders to share twisted strategies for keeping their congregations bound in deception. From the Marine Queen, she received the strength that manifested as a muscular, cobra-headed shadow looming behind her at the pulpit, guiding her hands as she blessed the crowd. Back at the Altar of Wonders, the ministry became a relentless machine for swallowing the hopes and wealth of the desperate. Juliet introduced the mirrors of life, commanding her members to speak into them every morning. While she told them it was for spiritual growth, the mirrors were actually occult tools that allowed her to peer into their private lives and gather the secrets she would later prophesy back to them. To Caleb, watching from the shadows, the holy water she sold was nothing more than salt and sugar, and the miracles were nothing more than a predatory trap. The candle flames flickered with an unnatural rhythm, casting long, distorted shadows against the velvet-lined walls of the private sanctuary. It was the eve of Juliet's 40th birthday, a day that should have been celebrated with hymns and laughter, but for Juliet, it was a day of bitter reckoning. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window, seeing a woman who had spent 15 years as a humble prayer warrior while her peers built empires of gold and marble. The small, rented hall of her current ministry felt like a cage, and the silence of the heavens had become deafening to her ears. She was tired of the struggle, tired of the poverty, and tired of being a footnote in the lives of the powerful. "You are tired of waiting for a God who moves at a snail's pace," a voice smoothed over the silence, dripping with a terrifying understanding. Pastor Benji stepped from the shadows, his presence radiating a cold, magnetic authority that made the hair on Juliet's arms stand up. He had watched Juliet for months at the conventions, identifying the exact moment her ambition would finally outweigh her fear. "Juliet, you want to move mountains, but you are still trying to dig with your fingernails. The world does not bow to the pious, it bows to the powerful. And power, real power, is never given, it is traded." Juliet turned, her breath hitching in her throat. "I want the altar of wonders to be more than just a name on a rusted sign, Benji. I want the thousands. I want the influence to change the course of this country. But I have prayed until my knees are calloused, and the pews remain empty." Benji smiled, a slow, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. "That is because you bring only your prayers. The great ones, the ones you see on television with private jets and mansions, they bring a key. But a key of this magnitude requires a heavy casting." He stepped closer, the air around him thickening with a scent like damp earth and ancient, brackish water. "To rule over the lives of many, you must surrender the life that could have been yours. The Marine Kingdom offers a seat at the table of the elite, but the chair is bought with your womb. You will be a mother to a nation of followers, but never to a child of your own blood. Is the crown worth the sacrifice?" The weight of 40 years of mediocrity pressed down on her like a physical hand. Juliet thought of the empty pews, the mocking whispers of other ministers, and the crushing weight of her own insignificance. She looked at Benji, her eyes hardening into a cold, dark resolve. "I am ready," she whispered. The ritual began in a blur of rhythmic, guttural chanting and the heavy, suffocating smoke of forbidden incense. As the clock struck midnight, marking her entry into her fourth decade, Juliet felt a sudden, sharp coldness bloom in the pit of her stomach, a freezing, permanent void where life and warmth should have been. A dark, muscular energy settled over her shoulders like a heavy, living cloak. She gasped as she felt the first invisible coil of the serpent spirit wrap tightly around her waist, claiming its new territory. When she finally opened her eyes, the world looked different. The shadows were no longer empty, they were alive with the secrets of the dark. Juliet stood up, no longer a humble servant, but a hybrid of human hunger and serpentine malice. The price was paid, and the altar of wonders was finally ready to be born in blood and deception. Caleb slipped into the back row of the altar of wonders, his presence swallowed by the thousands of bodies pressing together in a shared fever of hope and desperation. The sanctuary was a monument to excess, dripping in gold leaf and illuminated by spotlights that cut through the heavy haze of imported incense. At the front, prophetess Juliet stood like a beacon in her pristine white lace, her voice amplified until it vibrated in the very marrow of Caleb's bones. To everyone else, she was a vessel of the divine, but to Caleb, she was the architect of his sister's ruin. He kept his head low, his eyes scanning the peripheral shadows, looking for the seams in the perfection. The air grew heavy, an unnatural humidity settling over the congregation as the music reached a crescendo. Juliet raised her hand, and a sudden, practiced silence fell. "The Lord tells me there is a man here who hasn't walked in 5 years," she thundered. From the side aisle, a man was wheeled forward, his legs twisted and limp. The crowd began to chant, a low, rhythmic drone that made the floorboards hum. Caleb watched intensely as Juliet placed a hand on the man's forehead. He saw her lips move in a silent, guttural command, and for a fleeting second, the light seemed to bend around her, casting a distorted, muscular shadow against the back wall that looked nothing like a woman. "Stand up!" Juliet screamed. With a dramatic shudder, the man gripped the armrests and hoisted himself up. The hall erupted. People were weeping, falling to their knees, then waving handkerchiefs in a frenzy of belief. But as the man began to parade across the stage, throwing his hands to the heavens, Caleb's blood turned to ice. He knew that face. 3 days ago, while walking through the chaotic stalls of the central market, he had watched this same man, nimble and strong, heaving heavy crates of yams onto the back of a truck. There had been no wheelchair then, no twisted limbs, only the efficient movements of a paid actor. The realization hit Caleb with the force of a physical blow. The miracle was a choreographed lie, a spiritual theater designed to harvest the wealth of the brokenhearted. As he watched the man celebrate his fake healing, Caleb looked back at Juliet. In the strobe of the stage lights, he caught a glimpse of something beneath the hem of her gown, a shimmer of iridescent, diamond-shaped scales that shouldn't have been there. She turned her head toward the back of the room, her gaze sweeping over the thousands, and for a heartbeat, Caleb felt a cold, predatory intelligence lock onto his own. He wasn't just observing a fraud, he was standing in the den of a monster who had already begun to hunt. The silver-framed mirror sat on his late sister Sarah's vanity, a mocking reminder of the fate that had bled her dry before finally taking her life. It was an elegant object, etched with intricate swirling patterns that Juliet called divine windows, sold to the congregation for a sacrifice that could feed a family for a year. Caleb picked it up, feeling an unnatural chill seep through his palm. The glass didn't just reflect the room, it seemed to hold onto the light, swallowing it into a murky, bottomless depth. He remembered Sarah sitting here for hours, whispering her deepest fears and financial secrets into the glass, as Juliet had commanded, "Speak to the mirror, and the Almighty will hear your heart's cry." Caleb began to examine the frame with the precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. As he turned it under the dim yellow light of his apartment, he noticed the engravings weren't religious symbols at all. They were interlocking scales, identical to the ones he had glimpsed beneath Juliet's sleeves at the altar. Using a thin blade, he carefully pried at the backing of the mirror. It didn't pop open like a normal frame, it resisted, a low, subsonic hum vibrating against his eardrums until the wood finally gave way. Inside was a disturbing fusion of ancient occultism and modern intrusion. A thin, vein-like filament of copper wire was woven around a small, dark stone that pulsed with a faint, sickly green luminescence. But it was the center that made Caleb's stomach churn. Tucked behind the glass was a microscopic lens and a localized transmitter, powered by the very stone that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. It wasn't just a mirror, it was a digital and spiritual tether. Every tear Sarah had shed, every confession of her hidden debts, and every mention of their family's inheritance had been recorded and transmitted directly to the prophetic receivers at the altar of wonders. Juliet wasn't hearing the voice of God, she was reviewing data. She was a spiritual hacker, using the mirrors of life to harvest the vulnerabilities of her flock so she could mirror them back as divine revelations during her services. As Caleb stared into the dark glass, the green pulse of the stone quickened. Suddenly, the reflection of his own face began to distort. His eyes appeared sunken, then for a terrifying second, a muscular, scaly hand seemed to reach out from the depths of the mirror toward his throat. He dropped the mirror, the glass shattering against the floor into 1,000 jagged shards. Even in pieces, the fragments seemed to shimmer with a predatory intent. He finally understood the genius of Juliet's trap. She didn't need to be omnipresent when she had convinced her victims to invite her spies into their most private moments. Caleb knew then that his sister hadn't just died of poverty, she had been hunted from within her own bedroom. He began to gather the shards, his resolve hardening. He had the proof of the fraud, but the darkness behind the glass suggested that Juliet's power was far more than just technological. The basement of the altar of wonders breathed with a heavy, industrial dampness that smelled of stale water and cloying sweetness. Caleb moved through the shadows of the sanctuary preparation wing, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was the restricted heart of Juliet's empire, the place where the divine elixirs were birthed before being sold to the desperate for prices that could mortgage a small home. He ducked behind a stack of blue plastic drums, his camera phone ready, as the sound of rhythmic clinking approached. Through the gaps in the machinery, Caleb watched two of Juliet's most trusted aides, men who wore the masks of deacons but moved with the cold efficiency of factory workers. They weren't praying over the vats, they were dumping massive, industrial-sized sacks of cheap table salt and refined sugar into a churning mixer. Caleb zoomed in, capturing the labels of the local wholesalers. This was the miracle water that promised to cure terminal illness, nothing more than a saline solution designed to induce a temporary, chemical thirst that the faithful mistook for spiritual longing. Nearby, another aide was scenting cheap vegetable oil with a drop of pungent musk, bottling it as the oil of total restoration. The door at the far end of the room hissed open, and the temperature plummeted. Prophetess Juliet stepped into the light, her white gown glowing like a beacon in the grimy basement. Behind her, the air distorted, a massive, muscular shadow coiling around her shoulders, its cobra-like head swaying in time with her steps. The aides bowed their heads, not in reverence, but in visible terror. "Is the batch ready for the branding?" Juliet's voice was no longer the soothing melody of the pulpit, it was sharp and metallic. She walked to the central vat of water and reached out a hand. As her fingers brushed the surface, Caleb saw the skin of her forearm ripple and split, revealing a patch of emerald scales that shimmered with a sickly light. A drop of dark, viscous fluid, something that looked like black bile, secreted from her palm into the mixture. The water didn't just swirl, it hissed, the salt and sugar crystals glowing briefly with a predatory green luminescence before settling into a deceptively clear liquid. Caleb realized then that the fraud was only the surface. The salt and sugar provided the physical hook, but Juliet's blessing was a spiritual tether, a drop of the marine kingdom's essence designed to bind the consumer's soul to her altar. As he backed away into the darkness, he accidentally kicked a discarded sugar sack. The sound was a gunshot in the silence. Juliet's head snapped toward the shadows, her eyes flashing with a vertical, reptilian slit. Caleb turned and bolted into the labyrinth of the basement, the sound of a heavy, slithering weight beginning to pursue him through the dark. He had seen the recipe for her miracles, and it was a poison that targeted both the body and the spirit. Mr. Okiki sat in the plush velvet chair of Juliet's private counseling suite, his hands trembling as he clutched a briefcase filled with the offering he had been told would secure his empire. The room was heavy with the scent of expensive musk and the low, rhythmic hum of a hidden air purifier, but to Caleb, who was crouched in the ventilation shaft above, the air felt thick with a predatory musk. From his vantage point, Caleb watched as Juliet leaned across her mahogany desk, her eyes fixed on the wealthy businessman with a gaze that seemed to paralyze him like a rabbit in the headlights of a speeding car. She didn't look like a prophetess in that moment, she looked like a banker assessing a high-interest loan. "The spirit shows me a dark cloud over your home, Okiki," Juliet whispered, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. "It is not the economy that threatens your shipping business. It is the woman you sleep beside. Your wife, she is the anchor dragging you into the depths of the marine kingdom." Okiki gasped, his face paling. He had mentioned his wife's sudden coldness in the privacy of his bedroom only 2 nights ago, unaware that the mirror of life on his dresser had been broadcasting his every word to Juliet's servers. As Juliet spoke, Caleb saw the air behind her ripple. The muscular shadow of the serpent spirit began to uncoil from the rafters, its invisible weight causing the heavy desk to groan. It draped its thick, scaly arms over Okiki's shoulders, its cobra head hovering inches from the man's ear, whispering silent suggestions that manifest as sudden, irrational thoughts in the businessman's mind. Okiki's eyes glazed over, the light of reason dimming as the supernatural influence took hold. "She is a blockage to your destiny," Juliet continued, her fingers drumming a slow, hypnotic beat on the desk. "To save your wealth, you must sever the cord. The Lord demands a period of total isolation. You must move into the church's sanctuary guest house immediately. Do not speak to her. Do not see your children. They are the carriers of the curse she has placed upon you." Okiki nodded dumbly, reaching out to slide the briefcase across the desk. Juliet's hand closed over the handle, and for a split second, Caleb saw her skin shimmer into a vivid, reptilian green. By the time Okiki left the room, he was a ghost of a man, possessed by a manufactured fear. He ignored the frantic calls from his wife on his cell phone, his heart hardened by the prophecy that had turned his sanctuary into a battlefield. Juliet watched him go through the one-way glass, a cold, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She didn't care about his soul, she cared about the deed to his coastal warehouse and the liquid assets he had just signed over for spiritual fortification. Caleb, watching from above, felt a surge of nausea. He had seen her steal money, but watching her systematically dismantle a man's family for the sake of a larger seed was a new level of depravity. The altar of wonders wasn't just a church, it was an altar where lives were sacrificed to feed the hunger of a serpent that was never full. The air in the small consultation chamber felt thin and frigid, a stark contrast to the humid chaos of the main sanctuary. Caleb held his breath behind the heavy brocade curtains, his phone's camera lens peeking through a small gap. On the other side, a young man named Obiora, a fresh graduate whose threadbare shirt spoke of a long, fruitless search for work, knelt on the marble floor. He looked at Prophetess Juliet with the wide, terrified eyes of a man staring at his only hope. Juliet, looking regal in a gown that shimmered like moonlight on water, paced around him, her heels clicking a rhythmic, predatory beat. "I see a vision, my son," Juliet began, her voice dropping into a low, haunting vibration that seemed to make the room tremble. "I see a long road, a dark car, and a mother weeping over a closed casket. The spirit of death has marked your doorstep because your life battery is drained to its last spark." Obiora let out a choked sob, his forehead touching the cold floor. He had mentioned his fear of an early death to his mother near the mirror of life just the night before, and now, he believed God was speaking through the woman standing over him. As Caleb watched, the air behind Juliet began to thicken into a muscular, scaly mass. The serpent spirit uncoiled from the ceiling, its massive, cobra-like head descending until it was inches from Obiora's neck. Its tongue flicked out, tasting the graduate's fear, while its invisible arms tightened around his chest, making the boy gasp for air. Juliet didn't flinch, she leaned in closer, her eyes flashing with a cold, reptilian green light. "The grave is open, Obiora. It demands a life for a life. To jumpstart your battery and buy back your soul, you must provide a massive sacrifice. The spirit demands 7 healthy cows, 1 for every year of your education that the enemy wants to swallow." Obiora looked up, his face pale. Mama, I have nothing. I am just a graduate. We have only my father's small plot of land in the village." Juliet's expression didn't soften. "Then sell the land," she snapped, the lace of her sleeves rustling as she raised a hand. Caleb saw the skin on her palm split slightly, a dark, viscous drop of fluid falling onto Obiora's shoulder, acting as a spiritual brand. "Is your life worth less than a piece of earth? Bring the cash equivalent of those cows by Friday, or the casket I saw in the vision will be yours." Caleb felt a surge of white-hot rage as he recorded the transaction. He watched as the terrified boy promised to sell his family's only inheritance, weeping with gratitude that the prophetess had seen the danger. When Obiora finally stumbled out of the room, Juliet didn't offer a prayer. She simply turned to her desk, checked her bank app on her phone, and adjusted her gown. The serpent spirit coiled back into the shadows of the rafters, its hunger temporarily sated by the prospect of another life destroyed for profit. Caleb pulled back into the darkness, knowing that the death Juliet prophesied wasn't a vision of the future, it was the very destiny she was carving for her victims. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky choked by bruised clouds as Caleb crouched in the jagged reeds of the riverbank. The air here was different than the scented incense of the sanctuary. It was thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and a sharp, metallic tang that made his skin crawl. He had followed the silent hum of Juliet's black SUV through the winding back roads until she reached this desolate stretch of the water's edge. He adjusted his grip on his phone, the screen dimmed to the lowest setting, his breath coming in shallow, silent hitches. A few yards away, prophetess Juliet stepped out of the vehicle. She had stripped away her white lace gown, standing now in a shimmering silk slip that looked like oil on the surface of a dark pond. She moved with a strange, fluid grace, her joints appearing too loose, her neck stretching with an undulating motion as she faced the black water. Caleb zoomed his lens in, the digital stabilizer struggling against the darkness. Suddenly, Juliet began to chant. It wasn't the rhythmic prayers of the church, but a series of wet, clicking sounds that seemed to vibrate from her chest rather than her throat. The water began to churn, bubbling as if boiling from beneath, though no heat rose from it. Then, the horror truly began. Under the pale moonlight, Juliet's skin began to ripple. It looked as though thousands of tiny needles were pushing out from beneath her pores. With a sickening, wet sound, like leather being torn, her human exterior began to split and slough off. From the shoulders down, vivid emerald and charcoal scales erupted in a diamond pattern, shimmering with a bioluminescent slime. Her legs fused together, stretching and thickening into a massive, muscular tail that whipped through the mud, while her spine lengthened into a terrifying, serpentine curve. Caleb's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the phone as he watched the woman transform into a towering hybrid of human and serpent. The muscular spirit he had seen in the rafters was no longer a shadow, it was part of her, a physical manifestation of the marine covenant. She threw her head back, her face a mask of primal hunger, and slid into the river with a silent splash that barely disturbed the surface. As she vanished beneath the depths to meet her occultic kin, Caleb saw a trail of glowing green phosphorescence lingering in her wake. He stayed frozen in the mud, the footage saved, finally understanding that the altar of wonders was merely a feeding ground for the monster that had just disappeared into the dark. The following Sunday, the atmosphere inside the altar of wonders was not merely electric, it was predatory. The air felt charged with a static that made the hair on Caleb's neck stand rigid, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to emanate directly from the pulpit. Prophetess Juliet stood before the thousands, her white lace gown replaced by a dress of deep, iridescent emerald that shimmered like a serpent's belly under the stage lights. Her eyes, usually masked by a soft, practiced warmth, were now sharp and restless, darting across the sea of faces with a cold, kinetic intensity. She was no longer looking for souls to save, she was looking for the intruder who had dared to watch her at the river. As the worship music reached a dissonant, jarring peak, Juliet suddenly raised her hand, cutting the sound to a dead silence. "There is a thief in the house," she thundered, her voice vibrating with a metallic, non-human resonance. "A spy who thinks he can film the mysteries of the deep and go unpunished." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Caleb, buried in the middle of the crowd, felt his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. He kept his head low, but he could feel the weight of the serpent spirit, now a massive, invisible coil, slithering across the tops of the pews, searching for his heat. "I call for an altar call of fire." Juliet screamed, her pupils narrowing into vertical slits. "Everyone who wants to be protected from the coming darkness, come to the front now. If you stay in your seat, you are a carrier of the curse." The fear in the room was palpable as thousands surged forward, driven by the terror of being marked as an enemy. Caleb had no choice; to stay seated was to be exposed instantly. He moved with the crowd, his phone, filled with the damning footage of the river transformation, hidden deep in his pocket. As he reached the front, Juliet began to move through the line of kneeling congregants. She didn't lay hands on them, she marked them. Caleb watched in horror as she dipped her thumb into a bowl of dark, viscous oil, the same black bile he had seen her secrete in the basement, and drew a jagged, glowing green symbol on each forehead. When she reached Caleb, the temperature seemed to drop to freezing. The air behind her distorted, the muscular shadow of the cobra-headed spirit looming over him, its invisible hands gripping his shoulders with a crushing force. Juliet leaned down, her face inches from his. The scent of brackish water and rotting lilies filled his senses. "You think your little device can trap a queen," she hissed, her voice a low, reptilian rattle that only he could hear. She raised her thumb, the black oil shimmering with a malevolent light, and aimed it directly for his eyes. Caleb felt the serpent spirit's tongue flick against his cheek, a cold, wet warning of the doom she was about to seal. At that moment, he realized she wasn't just trying to bless him, she was trying to blind his spirit and erase the truth he had witnessed. He gritted his teeth, holding onto the memory of his sister's face to keep from screaming as the dark oil touched his skin. The dark oil was still wet on Caleb's forehead when he stumbled out of the sanctuary, but the mark of the prophetess had failed to dim his resolve. As soon as he reached the safety of the crowded street, he pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He didn't just upload the footage, he live-streamed it to every major news outlet and social media platform in the country. The video was undeniable, the high-definition horror of Juliet's skin sloughing off at the river, the emerald scales shimmering in the moonlight, and the audio of her metallic, reptilian voice admitting to the life battery scams. Within minutes, the digital world was ablaze, and the fire spread faster than any of Juliet's manufactured miracles. By Monday morning, the Altar of Wonders was no longer a sanctuary, it was a crime scene. A massive, disillusioned crowd, the same people who had knelt in awe just hours before, now stood outside the gold-plated gates with stones and placards. Their prayer guards had vanished, fearing the growing rage of the thousands who had realized their sacrifices had bought nothing but a serpent's luxury. When the authorities finally breached the private chambers, they found the mirrors of life shattered and the basement vats of salt and sugar overturned, but Juliet was gone. Some said she had fled back to the river, others swore they saw a massive green shadow slipping into the sewer lines beneath the city. Caleb stood amidst the ruins of the cathedral's lobby, watching as workers hauled away the mahogany pulpit. He felt no triumph, only a heavy, sobering clarity. He looked at the camera of a news reporter and spoke not of revenge, but of vigilance. He told the world that the most dangerous predators don't always hide in the dark, sometimes they stand in the brightest spotlights, wearing white lace and speaking in tongues. He warned that a true spiritual home is built on the sweat of service and the transparency of truth, not on life batteries, expensive oils, or the exploitation of the desperate. The collapse of Juliet's empire served as a harrowing testament to the cost of blind faith. The story of the serpent in the pulpit became a cautionary tale whispered in every household, a reminder that the ability to perform wonders is not a certificate of divinity. As the sun set over the abandoned altar of wonders, the golden cross on the roof reflected a fading light, leaving behind a community that had finally learned to look past the performance and search for the fruit. Caleb walked away from the wreckage, knowing that while the serpent had escaped, the scales had finally fallen from the eyes of the people.